And they said that they returned, but not all the boats returned. So there were 2 boats. They said, he asked, where'd the other boat go? He said, it went out far from the shore, and then it got swept away by a great river. So that was the African equatorial currents. And it just went west. So Abu Bakr built a fleet of 2,000 ships. And he sent them into that equatorial current. And it's theorized that they landed in present-day Belize, based on a number of factors that aren't the scope of what we're talking about here. And in any case, they never came back. And so they made that journey. Many other Muslims made the journey. And one of the evidences that Ivan van Sertima points to is the existence of a transatlantic gold trade between West Africa and the Caribbean and present-day North and South America based on the gold alloy. So especially Fulani people, Fulbe, are very, use a lot of ornamental gold, ornamental spearheads, swords, weapons. The alloy was, I think, something like 80% gold, 10% copper, 10% iron. And they found that exact alloy both in West Africa and in the Caribbean. So that's one evidence. He said you can't have a coincidence like that you're going to have a gold alloy exactly the same on both sides of the Atlantic. Another, he also examines evidence from textile, the textile patterns, and find exact same ones on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, these are coincidence. These can't be coincidental developments. So he established with other research a West African, Caribbean, Americas gold trade and a textile trade. Next. So this is called an Olmec head. The Olmec heads, they're giant stone heads that were carved in the present day near the area where the Yucatan Peninsula meets Mexico. So in that area they found many of these heads, and they're based on African models. Like the features from the back, you see braids, things that are not found in the Americas. And again, he just uses this as sort of background evidence to establish that Africans were here in the Americas, here in the Caribbean. And so the Olmec heads, this is just another evidence that he has, because the facial features, the braid, the nature of the braids are only found in Africa. They're not found in the Caribbean, they're not found in America. So that's just another proof that Ivan van Sertima used to establish the ability of Africans to cross the Atlantic, and they're coming from West Africa, and West Africa is majority Muslim. So they're not coming from South Africa, Angola, present-day South Africa, the Zulu, and other tribes. They're coming from West Africa, where you have the Muslim tribes, the Wolof, Mandinka, Bambara, Fulbe, Hausa. That's the area that they're coming from. Next. So this is a Wolof cavalryman. So the Wolof, who present-day Senegal is probably the strongest concentration, is a Muslim tribe who are very astute, skilled horsemen. And so this is just one of their warriors during the probably the early 19th century. So the European colonization has started, but you have a lot of resistance movements. And so why is this significant? Next slide, please. This is Christopher Columbus. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So this is Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is not his birth name. Christopher Columbus is Italian. His birth name was Cristobal Colon. Cristobal Colon. When he went, after the Muslims were expelled from Spain, and Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to send an expedition to India to tap into the riches of India, Cristobal Colon became Christopher Columbus. Now, why is the name significant? The first slave revolt in 1522 was undertaken by a group of Wolof horsemen. So they didn't have horses, they were on the current, what was then called Hispaniola. Hispaniola is the current home of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The Wolof Muslim slaves, they commandeered some horses, and once they got the horses, they routed the Spanish garrison, and they escaped into the forest, and they established a maroon colony. So that was the first slave revolt. The plantation they were on was the plantation of Don Carlos Colon, the son of Christopher Columbus. So you can see how the history is intertwined from the very beginning, that Christopher Columbus's son establishes a plantation on Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic, and he has Muslim slaves. And the Muslim slaves revolt and go into the forest and establish a Maroon community. So it's an independent, free community where they're living as Muslims. And so where did this happen? On the plantation of the son of Christopher Columbus, just to give you an indication of the historical roots. Next slide, please. This is Ayyub bin Sulaiman, Job bin Solomon, the fortunate slave. Job bin Solomon was an alim. He studied at Timbuktu. He was Hafiz al-Quran. I actually forgot. In any case, so we go from Spanish colonization, which ends in North America, except further west, like the western state, New Mexico, Colorado, California, that area, you still have Spanish colonization. In the south and eastern United States, other than Florida, Florida didn't become an American state until 1826. Before that, it was under Spanish control. And a lot of slaves would run away to Florida because they would have relative freedom. They had a system similar to the early Muslim Mawadi system, that the runaways would become protectorates of the Spanish. So in any case, the British took most of present day, the East Coast and Northeastern United States, and those became the first states. Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc. I'm going to digress. So we talked about those states. Is Virginia wearing her New Jersey? Idaho, what will Delaware? Idaho, Alaska. In any case, don't worry about that. Let's move right along. So Ayyub bin Sulaiman is called the fortunate slave. Again, to give you a sense of history, again, he was Hafiz of Quran. He was a scholar of the religion. He was trained in the religious sciences. He knew the trivium and the quadrivium. So this was the classical sort of Greek scholastic tradition, which the Muslims adopted. So at its foundation was grammar, rhetoric, and logic. So al-nahu, wal-mantaq, wal-balagha. Those were the foundations, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And then the trivium, geometry, mathematics, music, being the relationship between sound and time, and astronomy, the wider cosmos. So explaining that is a whole lecture. In any case, he knew all of that. So Ayyub bin Sulaiman was taken prisoner and sold. Then he landed in Annapolis, Maryland, and he was sold into slavery in Kent County, Maryland. So he used to pray. He was a very pious young man. He would pray, but when he prayed, the master's children would come and find him. They pour dirt on his head and just do naughty things. So he ran away. And eventually they found him in Pennsylvania. He went from Maryland, which borders Pennsylvania, into Pennsylvania. They found him. When they brought him back, they asked him, why did he run away? He said, I couldn't pray in peace. Like, these brats are disturbing me. Usually what happens when a slave runs away and then they're caught and brought back, they're brutally beaten to make an example for other slaves. Ayyub bin Sulayman, his master, said, why'd you run away? I couldn't pray in peace. He gave him a musalla. He gave him a space where he could pray. So it's called the fortunate slave. And his story, the fortunate slave, is the oldest extant work of African American literature. So and I've seen a copy of it in Schomburg Museum in New York. In any case, he still wasn't happy. He said, like, our people were cattle people, were horse people. So the master gave him the responsibility over the cattle and the horse. So he was Fulani. And he still wasn't happy. So he wrote a letter in Arabic to be sent to his father. So he heard that the ship that brought him to America had returned to Annapolis. So he wrote a letter in Arabic asking his father, who was the king of Bandu. Bandu is currently southeastern Senegal. So it's on the border of Fouta Djallon, which is the homeland of the Fulani. In any case, so the letter goes to Annapolis. When it gets to Annapolis, the boat has sailed to England. And so the letter is dispatched to England. When it gets to England, the ship had gone back to West Africa. The letter ends up in the hand of James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe was one of the founders of the then slave-free colony of Georgia. So Georgia initially was a slave-free colony. Oglethorpe gets the letter, miraculously. He can't read Arabic. He sends it to Oxford or Cambridge, I forget which one, for the Orientalists there to read it. So when they translated the letter, he was so impressed with the erudition, the scholarship of the writer, he sent the gold to Maryland to purchase the freedom of Ayyub bin Sulayman. Now, he's only been in America. He brought in Annapolis. He arrived there in 1831. He was there in 1731. I'm sorry. So the period so we go from the Spanish, British colonization. So 1731. He's only in America 18 months. He never learns English. Sailing across the Atlantic, in 6 weeks he learned English. He learned English to such a level, when he got to England, he could actually have religious debates with the scholars at Cambridge and Oxford. They were so impressed, they got him an audience with the king and made him a full member of the Spalding Regents Society. That society included Alexander Pope and Sir Isaac Newton. A lot of his life we know from the records of the Spalding Regent Society, because they had records and biographies of their members. So we have the fortunate slave, oldest extant work of African American literature. Then we have the records of the Spalding Regent Society. While he's in England, he writes 3 copies of the Quran from his memory. And one of them still exists. I was going to print some pages, but I forgot. And in any case, he goes back to Africa. That's a whole story. I'm spending too much time with Ayyub bin Sulayman. He has a miraculous story, but we'll move right on, inshallah, because we started late. This is Ibrahim Abdurrahman, prince amongst slaves. So he was so regal in his appearance, his manners, that they called him prince, but he actually was a prince. He was the son of Allahumma salli sulila, yani Karamuko Alpha. I forget his father's full name, but his father was the king of the Fulani, and his father was the one who actually united the Fulani and established an independent kingdom in Fouta Djallon. He was also trained in Timbuktu. because these are the elites. And so they're given an elite Islamic education. Timbuktu, its decline at its peak, it was the highest level of Islamic scholarship in the Ummah. And it's called the city of 1,000,000 manuscripts, many of which still exist. And all of the Islamic sciences, physical sciences, linguistic sciences, astronomy, an incredible collection of scholarship. Just to give you an idea of the level of scholarship in Timbuktu at its height, there was an Azhari scholar, Abdurrahman al-Tamimi, who wanted to go to Timbuktu to teach. So he packed up, he went across the desert, he went to Timbuktu, he sat in on one of the lessons of the scholars there, and he said, I can't teach here. He went to Marrakesh in Morocco and he studied for several years. And then he went back to Timbuktu to teach. And so the great scholar Ahmed Bamba, and when the Berbers had come across the desert and invaded Mali, and Ahmed Bamba went to Marrakesh to escape, and he became one of the principal teachers in Morocco, the great scholar of Timbuktu. In any case, it was a high level of scholarship. And so Ibrahim Abdurrahman, another miraculous story, he came across the Caribbean, up the Mississippi, and settled in Natchez, Mississippi. He also wrote a letter in Arabic to the king of Morocco to ask him to petition the U.S. government for his freedom. Morocco was the first sovereign nation. There's a debate, was it Algeria or Morocco? But most say Morocco. I have a copy of the charter to recognize the independence of the United States. And so there were very strong relations between Morocco and the United States. So his letter reached the Emir of Morocco. So this was 1826-27. He arrived in Natchez, Mississippi in 1791. So now we move from colonization, early America. And so you have Muslims. These are just some whose lives are most well documented. It was estimated 20% of the slaves were Muslims that came here from Africa. In any case, so the king of Morocco sends a message to the United States President, John Quincy Adams, who sends his Secretary of State, Henry Clay, to the plantation, and personally, the master didn't even take money. There are other miraculous aspects. He goes on a speaking tour throughout the then United States. He came to Boston. In Boston, he linked up with Reverend David Walker. So if you're familiar with African American history, David Walker was the author of David Walker's Appeals, an appeal for the freedom of the African slaves. And it's said that Ibrahim Abdurrahman was very influential in the creation of David Walker's Appeal. He actually spoke in David Walker's church. In any case, he gathers enough money to free his wife and a few of his children, not all of them. They sail back to Africa as free people. And they thought he converted to Christianity. As soon as he got inside of Africa, he prayed on the ship. So a lot of slaves, and the next one will tell you an amazing story. And the next, so this is Umar bin Said. Umar bin Said was also educated at Timbuktu. They had the great Sankore University. And they had other schools, but the flagship institution in Timbuktu was Sankore University. And so these African American Muslims, or African Muslims in the Americas, The three we mentioned all were educated at Timbuktu, so you have scholars coming over here. A book I would highly recommend if you want to look into this issue is Sylvian Diouf, African Muslims and Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas. Next week I could bring a bibliography, inshallah. So let's go back to Umar. So Umar bin Sa'id, he was the most prolific writer of all of the slaves. He wrote the first 13 pages from memory of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani's Risala. So Risala, Ibn Abi Zayd, a very popular fiqh book, introduction in Aqidah, and then the rest is fiqh. He wrote many pages from Quran. So they thought he converted to Christianity also. So they asked him to write the Lord's Prayer. And next week I'll show you a copy of it in Arabic. So you know what he wrote? He wrote, نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. That's what he wrote. So the verse from Surah Saf and then the Surah Nasr. And he said, okay, you want me to write the Lord's Prayer? Here it is. نصر من الله وفتح قريب. Help is from Allah and a speedy victory. وَبَشِّرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Give glad tidings to the believers. And when comes the help of Allah and victory, and you see the people entering into the deen of Allah in crowds, so glorified the praises of your Lord. Verily, He is most forgiving, most accepting of repentance. La ilaha illallah. Muslims were fasting, Muslims were praying under slavery conditions, fasting on a starvation diet. So when Ramadan comes, don't say, I can't fast, I work. Where do you work? In an air-conditioned office. How do you get to work? In an air-conditioned car. Do you use your air conditioner? Not now, it's winter, it's already cool. And the days are short. They were fasting in the fields, in cotton fields, in tobacco fields in Georgia, and Carolinas, and Alabama, and Mississippi, in the sweltering heat on a starvation diet, a semi-starvation diet. It's like what the Zionists did to the Palestinians in Gaza. They said, we're going to put them on a diet and count the calorie, enough to keep people alive, but not enough to have good health. But it was worse than that in slavery, of course. Why? Because the average working life of a slave was 13 to 14 years. And so there's enough nutrition to keep you healthy, to work for 13, 14 years, and then you just die. A lot of slaves just drop dead in the fields. Why? Where does 80 cents from every healthcare dollar in our country right now, where does it go to? 80 cents for every healthcare dollar. Goes for senior, Medicare. So the senior go to these convalescent homes, these skilled nursing facilities, these, they have a very euphemistic name. And all their savings are burned through, and once they reach $2,000, they automatically get Medicare. Or is it Medicaid? Medicare. Automatic. And so every 80 cents, and then some of us are old enough, you start falling apart. And you have to get like an old car, you have to start fixing it. So first 5 years, car is great. Right? Then the alternator goes, timing belt goes, the water pump goes, the tires have to be fixed. The brakes, the rotors, you can't just do the pads. Now you got to do the rotors and the pads. So if you're a slave owner, you're not going to spend every 80 cents from $1 of profit on old slaves. That's not good business. So your objective is to get the maximum amount of work in the minimum amount of time, and then just let people die or drop dead. So that's the conditions that these Muslims were fasting under. Next one. This is Yarrow Mamout. So Yarrow Mamout is probably the oldest living person in American history. He lived 126 years. He was known, and he worked and he bought his freedom. He bought his freedom. And he has a house which still exists in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., near Georgetown University. He's famous for walking through the street, making dhikr and reading Quran and stopping to pray anywhere. This is during slavery. So, and he was so impressive. Charles Willson Peale, one of the greatest American painters, look how beautiful. That was painted by Charles Willson Peale. Again, if you're familiar with American history, Charles Willson Peale, he painted a portrait of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Yarrow Mamout. Your Muslim, our Muslim grandfather. La ilaha illallah. And he's probably the oldest living American. He lived 126 years. He was probably over 100 when this picture was taken. And so if you read his biography, he was known. He would make dhikr. They would say he's singing the praises of God. He would stop and pray and like, oops, Bismillah. Probably look at the sun as opposed to a rich one. Put it down, Allahu Akbar. He didn't care. In slavery, may Allah bless all of these ancestors. These are Muslim ancestors in America. You might say, I'm not African. It's a spiritual ancestry. A lot of us aren't Arabs, right? Is Khadija our mother? Is Aisha our mother? Salama, Juwayriya, Habiba? They are mothers? Yeah, they are mothers. We're not Arab. These are Muslim ancestors. You might not be African. Egyptians are Africans. Last time I checked, Egypt was in Africa. You guys take advantage of it. You get special consideration. Say, why do you hire me? Oh no, we have minority preference. I'm an African American. Oh, you're Egyptian American. Do you know geography? Egypt's in Africa. So is Morocco. Yalla, next. This is Edward Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Now, why is Blyden important? All those slaves we saw, they were through different periods of American, British colonization. Ayyub bin Suleiman. Early America, 1776, 1791. Ibrahim Abdurrahman comes to Natchez, Mississippi. Umar bin Said, 1840s, 50s, right before the Civil War. He comes to Fayetteville, North Carolina. So throughout, now slavery ends. And with the end of slavery, you have the end of an influx, even though importation of slaves were outlawed in 1806, but slaves are still coming through illegal channels. Slavery, that stopped. Now, what you notice here, all of these were men. So there was a disproportionately high number of Muslim men and a low number of Muslim women who were coming. There's a famous Muslim woman, Aminatu, who was, when the British took New York, or when the revolutionaries took New York from the British, because the British were the colonizers. In the Revolutionary War, remember, Washington's coming from the south. He crosses the Delaware, that was into New Jersey. And eventually the revolutionaries, they took New York. When they took New York, they passed an edict that all of the free slaves living in New York could be given back to their owners and sent back to their plantations. So the British government evacuated as many slaves as they could to Canada. And the lady who was recording the names of those slaves who were evacuating is called the Book of the Negroes, which I saw the names in Canada. She was a Muslim. She was raised a Muslim. Her name's Aminatu. And she was recording those names. So that's one famous Muslim woman. But generally, there were far more men. Why were there far more men than women? How did most of the slaves become slaves? They were kidnapped on hunting expeditions. Who's going out to hunt? The men. And they were prisoners of war. And so the slaves in Brazil, most of them were prisoners of war from the jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria. So he established the Sokoto Khilafah. They established an Islamic state. And so they're fighting all the non-Muslim tribes and eventually the British. And so the POWs are being sold to the slave masters on the coast and then sent to the Americas. So you had, because women weren't out there fighting, you had a disproportionately large number of Muslim men. Sisters are like, where are those days? Moving right along. So they're all men, which meant what? That they had a difficult time establishing families. So either like Ibrahim Abdurrahman, they married Christian women and just did the best to raise their children as Muslims, but their mothers weren't Muslims. Their mothers didn't know Arabic like them. Or they never married. So you saw Umar bin Said, he never married. Ayub Suleiman left before he had an opportunity to marry, but he never married. He was only here 18 months, so that sort of explains that. But it was difficult to establish families. And then when you could establish a family, your wife, your children could be sold. A lot of the, one of the means to put freed slaves back on plantations were the loitering laws. So after the Revolutionary War, you had a lot of men, women walking across the South trying to find their sold family members. And because of that, they made these loitering laws. Do you live here? No. I'm trying to find my son. I'm trying to find my wife. I'm trying to find my husband. And they made laws that if you didn't have any, couldn't establish residency, they put you in these prisons. But many of these prisons were plantations. To this day, the state prison in Angola, Louisiana is called the Angola Plantations. And it's a huge plantation. And it has de facto slave labor to this very day. And a lot of that is rooted in these loitering laws. So in any case, it was hard to establish families. So as we move further and further away from the slavery period, with new slaves coming from Africa, some areas, 50% of the slaves were Muslims. Parts of Virginia. Kunta Kinte was in Virginia. He was from Gambia. I visited his, I'll show you when I went to his village. Next week, we'll do some of those video clips, inshallah ta'ala. In any case, Virginia, Kunta Kinte, roots. That area of Virginia, upwards of 50% of the slaves were Muslims. The coastal islands of South Carolina and Georgia, overwhelmingly Muslim. Why? Because they grew rice and indigo. Rice is a labor-intensive crop. So the slave owners would prefer slaves from rice-growing areas in Africa. And one of the richest rice-growing areas in Africa is the Gambia River area. And so the slaves knew how to grow rice, so they would prefer slaves from those areas. So Senegambia area is 90% Muslim. So those rice-growing areas had a disproportionately high percentage of Muslims amongst the population. So Blyden is important. Blyden was he wanted to go to Queens College. Queens College is currently part of Rutgers University. At the time, so we're talking around 1850, he wanted to go to Queens College, which was originally was a Christian college. They wouldn't let him in, but they told him he could be a missionary for the church and go to Africa. So you go figure that. You can't study here, but you can go spread the message of a benevolent God in Africa. So he accepts the offer. He goes to West Africa as a Christian missionary. In West Africa, he becomes so fascinated with the Muslim culture and how Islam united the various tribes into a common culture. So we mentioned earlier, you have the Wolof, you have the Mandinka, you have the Bambara, you have the Fulani, the Hausa, you have the Bababira, the Tawarigh. You have all of these Muslim tribes, and they share a common culture. And they have a level of unity, even though there is wars between these groups sometimes, but a basic level of unity that's not found amongst the non-Muslim peoples. So he was a Pan-Africanist. He wanted to see unity amongst the African peoples in the diaspora. And so what was called and came to be called as the Black Atlantic. So from the United Kingdom, which is an integral part of the slave trade, and also one of the principal colonizers in the Caribbean, where you have a lot of slaves and a lot of African folk. And the eastern coast and southern United States, we mentioned the Caribbean, and then South America. Particularly, we mentioned Brazil. A lot of the soldiers in Uthman Danfodio's jihad ended up being sold to Brazil, and they were instrumental in the Great Slave Revolt in Brazil of 1836. Again, they almost succeeded. One of the women panicked and alerted the Portuguese, and so the element of surprise was lost. But that slave revolt probably would have succeeded, and the Muslims would have taken over the northeastern corner of Brazil. In any case, Blyden, so what Blyden, he saw in Islam a source, a potential source, unifying source for African people in the diaspora. And they said he converted. This is an historical debate. Did Edward Blyden himself become a Muslim or not? Some say he did, some say he didn't. But what's important is he became so fascinated with Islam that he wrote very influential books. The most influential is called Islam, Christianity, and the Negro. And that book popularized Islam amongst African American intellectuals. And that popularization led to a reemergence of Islam amongst African people. That reemergence, next slide please, I'll try to wrap it up. One of the first movements was the movement of Noble Drew Ali, who started a movement in Newark, New Jersey in 1913 called the Moorish Science Temple. So they call themselves Moors, or West African Muslims further north. The Moroccans, who went into Spain, they were called the Moors by the Europeans. Ivan van Sertima has written an incredible book about the Moorish presence in the Iberian Peninsula, present-day Spain and Portugal. In any case, Noble Drew Ali. Now it's an experiment with Islam, but it's not totally Islam. They had the name, the Moorish Science Temple. They called the book the Quran, but it was a combination of the Quran, the Bible, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That was their Quran. But they established a strong presence in the northern inner city communities in Newark and Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, of a people beginning to look at Islam and think about Islam as an alternative way of life. So this is Noble Drew Ali. Next slide, please, up close. So his name was Timothy Drew, but he took the name Noble Drew Ali, and he called his movement the Moorish Science Temple. And they were very influential on the Nation of Islam. Next slide, we're wrapping up. I know we started. Now this is a fascinating individual. This individual, his name is Dusay Muhammad, an Egyptian mother, a Sudanese wife, Egyptian father, and a Sudanese mother. When he was 9 years old, they sent him. He wanted to be an actor, so they sent him to England to learn acting. He's reputed to be the first African American to play Othello in Shakespeare's play. The first African descent person to play Othello. He was a very brilliant historian. He was a brilliant writer, and he started a newspaper while he was in England called African Times and Orient. Next slide, please. That's actually a copy, one of the covers from the newspaper. It's an extremely influential newspaper that was had an impact on the Egyptian nationalist movement, the Nigerian nationalist movement, and several others. He also wrote a history of Egypt. Next slide, please. This is Dusay Muhammad at the left side in the front. So he went from Egypt to England. In England, he starts the newspaper, and he's a principal organizer for both the Africans and the Indians and the Muslims in diaspora. And his paper focused on those three groups primarily. He then goes to Detroit, Michigan. This is Detroit, Michigan. He helped to unite the Iraqi Shi'i and Sunni, Lebanese Shi'i and Sunnis, and others into one of the first. They built the first Muslim masjid in Detroit. They unified the community. You see the ethnic diversity here. And if you want to read about that, there's a book called Islam in Old Detroit. It's an incredible book. In any case, he also wrote a history of England Egypt while he was in England. One of the most influential Egyptian historians. Next slide, please. So all you Egyptians, guys, you have to get this book, In the Land of the Pharaohs by Dusay Muhammad. And I think you can still get it on Amazon. And so he says from where? From what? I can't read it. What does the subscript say? And below that, from when? And one of the pashas. Yeah, Buttress Pasha. Peter Pasha. Peter Pasha picked the pickled peppers. So, a short history of Egypt from the fall of Ismail to the assassination of Buttress Pasha by Dusay Muhammad. So this is an incredible genius. He also, and we'll stop here, continue next week and to the present. The next slide, please. Dusay Muhammad, when he was in London, he was the mentor of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey came from Jamaica. He went to England. He studied under, he wrote for the paper of Dusay Muhammad. So he's mentored by a Muslim. And his motto was one God, one people, one mission. He started the most powerful movement in the history of African Americans, even probably more powerful than the Nation of Islam. He started a steamship line. He started a newspaper. He started, he has an economic network, and he gave in his paper, Do Say Muhammad, and then someone will introduce next year, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, who was from India. They wrote pan-Islamic messages in the paper of Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey, he comes from England to Harlem. In Harlem, he built what has became known as the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. And the United Negro Improvement Association establishes a nationwide network, and that network is instrumental in financing the steamship line. The steamship line ultimately was its purpose to take African Americans back to Africa. So Garvey's like, we need a means to transport. He became so influential, what happened? What do you think happened? They didn't kill him, they imprisoned him and deported him. And so, yeah, we'll get to that. Malcolm X's mother was one of the principal writers for his newspaper, and Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, was one of the principal organizers in the Midwest for the Garvey movement. And so Malcolm didn't come out of a vacuum. And this is we'll stop here. It'll be a good segue. So actually the next slides are the mother and father of Malcolm X. So everything begins to converge in Malcolm X. All of these movements. Malcolm X historically is an incredibly important, significant Muslim figure. But that's next week. So we'll stop here. So any questions or comments? If not, you could ask them next week, because we're way over the time, because we started way late. But, you know, this is our history. This is our Muslim history. You can't say, oh, I don't feel like I have any roots. I'm going back to Pakistan or here or there. These are our Muslim roots. They're deeper than the roots of an Arnold Schwarzenegger. They were going to change the Constitution so Schwarzenegger could run for president. He had a little problem with his maid, and that went down the drains. But here he's still speaking with an Austrian accent, and he's going to run for president. Like, how does that compare to the roots of the Muslim community in the Americas? That's no roots, first generation, still speaking with an accent. We have people that were here before even British colonization. If we had time, we could have talked about Pedro Khilafo. Pedro Khilafo, he was a Wolof Muslim. It's called Latino. The Latinos were the Muslims that supposedly accepted Christianity. And then when he came to the New World, he started making da'wah, like many others, to the native people. He started making da'wah. And the Spanish found out, they boiled them to death in a pot of oil, thinking around 1540. And his crime, propagating Islam amongst the native people in this land. So we have history. We mentioned the first slave revolt, that Muslims were a problem from the jump. The Muslims, 1522. So our roots are deep. Don't let anyone tell you you don't belong. This is a Judeo-Christian, yada, yada, yada. Say, look, the Muslims are here long before a lot of you folks were here. May Allah give us tawfiq. May Allah give us fahm. Man yuridi lahu bihi khayran yufakkihu fi ddin. May Allah give us fiqh, in this context, fahm. Bless us to understand. Walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.